Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve Podcast. Today's guest is a podcaster and food and beverage critic all the way from Columbus, Ohio. His name is Ray Chmielecki.
Close. Yeah, we say Chmielecki. That's pretty close. That's pretty close. It's way better than probably 95% of people would come up with.
Chmielecki. Okay, all right. I don't always get the names right, but I tried. I did my best.
It's a tough one, and then also, I mean, we're not even sure we say it right. It's a Polish last name, but okay. I mean, we probably say it like the Americanized way. So there's probably I have yet to meet anybody who's from Poland. So when I do, I will ask them, "How do you say this?" And I'm sure it's going to be completely different than the way we've been doing it for years. But
well, that's interesting. So you've got Polish descent. What was that on your parents' side, or what was
yeah, my dad's side. I think it's probably goes back to it's either his grandfather or his great grandfather. Whenever they immigrated over to the U.S. But yeah, mostly Polish, and then there's some German and Slavic and Czech and all that kind of stuff mixed into as well. But majority of it is Polish on my dad's side.
It sounds like your family moved sort of in the early 20th century to the U.S. Is maybe that right, or maybe earlier?
I think so. It's somewhere around there.
Okay.
I think it was probably during when all the immigration was happening, even with you have the Irish immigration and all that stuff. So I think it's kind of in that time frame. I don't really know for certain. I think, I'm trying to remember if any family members have had to do a family tree project on that side, and I just can't think of anything. So
enough, man. Well, it's always cool to know your heritage, isn't it? I think my mum's done some tracing of ours, and it's kind of boring, to be honest. On my dad's side, there's a bit of French, a bit of Irish, but on my mum's side, it's like our family just never went anywhere or did anything. It's like, okay, I don't know. I mean, in my family so far, the only people that have traveled are myself and I believe my great grandparents as well. They were cool. They were like an old couple that would go to places like Japan. They went to Japan in their 70s, man. I was like, that's awesome. But yeah, the rest of my family just never really goes anywhere. They do the standard package holidays to France and Spain. And okay, yeah, I know that makes me sound a bit judgmental, but I don't know. There's a whole world out there, you know what I mean? And sometimes I get a bit puzzled about a holiday which is literally just 2 weeks on a beach at a resort with a bunch of people from your own country. That will always blow my mind a little bit, because for me, I don't know, I like to, when I go to another country, I like to, as much as possible, immerse myself in the local culture, speak the language, do whatever. Try and get the most out of it, get a different experience from what you have back home, I suppose. But
yeah, I've never been an all-inclusive kind of person, like cruises. I don't understand people that do cruises. I get people like them, and that's great. For me, I have zero interest. I think the only way you'd get me on a cruise, it'd have to be Alaska or Antarctica or something like that. Something super, super unique. Where I'm not going to go on a cruise in the Bahamas. I have no interest in ever doing that. So
I've never been on a cruise either, and I was interested in going on one potentially, but then I watched this video the other day. There's this guy. I found him recently. I highly recommend you check him out. And everyone listening, go check this guy out. On YouTube, there's a guy called Ordinary Things. He's a British guy that basically does very kind of sarcastic, Charlie Brooker-esque kind of videos where he just talks about anything from the popularity, rise and fall of fedora hats, or the death of Ronald McDonald, or what else is it? The soda, the Coca-Cola and soda, and he did one on cruise ships, and it just put the fear of God in me. I never realized that even pre-COVID, cruise ships is one of the hot spots for catching diseases and stuff, and diseases, but illnesses. And they actually have these massive banners and advertisements when you're on the ships that say oh, wash your hands all the time. You know what I mean? And because people just often get, and I suppose it makes sense. You're out at sea, you're stuck with a bunch of people, and, you're probably prone to getting things like flu and But it's just disgusting, like this idea that people don't wash their hands or take care of their personal hygiene and stuff, and you're essentially like in a small container where you're literally contained with these people in
It's
a
like a
disease.
floating petri dish, essentially. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's like, oh my God. But yeah, and then I also saw some small videos showing like, you know, the difference between what's sold to you maybe in a travel brochure and then the reality. So obviously in the travel brochures you see, oh look, these lovely deckings, and you know you're in the sun and you're on a stretcher by the water and it's all lovely and there's barely anyone around. But the reality is there's like 200 people in the same area and it's packed and you could barely move. Like, I don't know, that's my idea of a fucking nightmare right there. Like, just
Yeah.
oh, I want to get as far away from people as possible if I'm on holiday.
No. Yeah. When you travel, I mean, yeah, I mean, you want to do something unique and something that you enjoy. I mean, I understand the people that enjoy cruises, and I get it because it's just, you know, I pay you money and I don't have to think about the rest of it. But for me personally, that's just not the way I want to travel. And I mean, I would never recommend it to everybody, but to each their own, I guess, kind of on that front.
What's your favorite type of holiday?
Man, I mean, I wish that we had here in America just better vacation time. I mean, we don't get, like, you guys get the, you know, over in Europe and stuff, they get the month of August off and stuff like that. We don't get that here, but I mean, for us, it's always just, you know, we build around just kind of restaurants that we go to, is kind of how we build our trips. So it's like, where do we want to go eat? Can we find 4 or 5 places that we want to go eat? And we just kind of build everything, you know, around that.
You mentioned getting off the month of August. I'm a bit confused by what you mean there, because I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for other countries. I can speak for the UK. We have a system here, which is basically 28 days paid holiday. Mm-hmm. But what that actually looks like is probably about 21 days of actual holiday time. And the remaining 7 days, they basically cheat you. The remaining 7 days are what we call bank holidays here. So, like, you know, traditionally the actual banks would be shut, and they are, but most shops tend to be shut and businesses on those days. And that's the same every Sunday after a certain time here in the UK as well. But it's a bit of a cheat because bank holidays are not, I mean, they are holidays in the sense that they'll always fall on like a Monday or very rarely on a Friday or whatever. Mm-hmm. But everything's shut. So it's like, well, okay, it's a holiday, but you can't do anything really. You
gotcha.
know what I mean? Yeah. So like when they're selling that to you in the job interview, like, yeah, you get 28 days paid holiday. And it's like, well, no, you don't, do you? You get 20 days paid holiday and these extra days that you include to make it look like, you know, make yourselves look good, but it's not the same thing. So I just wanted to probe you on that. What do you mean by that?
Well, usually I think it's mainly like Spain, right? Like Spain, France, those countries, they're pretty much off. I know Spain specifically is pretty much off. Like a lot of people take vacation pretty much in August, and kind of like the whole country not shuts down.
Okay.
But like a lot of people, that's kind of when they take vacation. And it just, you know, with Spain, I mean, you have like the siesta in the middle of the day and everything like that. You know, America is probably one of the worst in terms of work-life balance and time off and everything like that. I remember it was a couple of years ago, Cadillac ran like a commercial. I don't remember if it was like in the Super Bowl or whatever, but the whole concept of the commercial was just like, we work way more than everybody else, so like you could have a Cadillac kind of thing. It was really strange, and you can find it probably like on YouTube. The actor who was in it, he's like a character actor. I think his name's like Neil something. He's in a bunch of stuff like Band of Brothers. He was in there. He's usually like kind of a character actor, kind of villain guy. A really good actor though, but it was just, there was some backlash when that came out. That was a couple of years ago, and I think with COVID and everything, it's just gotten way worse. With now we're having people, you know, there's this whole kind of people trying to figure out, are people not willing to go back to work because the jobs that they were working sucked with in terms of, you know, benefits and pay and work-life balance, or, you know, they're not incentivized to return, or is it those industries that a lot of people were already in, they decided, I don't want to go back to that industry because this happened once, it can happen again, there's no stability, all that kind of stuff too as well. So
yeah, this is an interesting conversation. I've seen the same sort of conversations occurring in the UK right now. There's a YouTuber that I follow called Joshua Fluke who talks a lot about this. I think he's based in Utah or something like that. But he's constantly commenting on basically a combination of employers on LinkedIn that have a very skewed kind of perception of how things should be, and then what the media in the US is saying. And it seems to be the prevailing thought is this big argument between, as you said, like remote working and what actual benefits are workers offered and stuff. And we have the same arguments here. And all I can see from a lot of the major companies and businesses is that they're trying to put forward this narrative of, oh, well, remote working is not efficient. It's not efficient. It's bad for business. And it's like, well, actually the statistics prove otherwise. And maybe you need to give this to people, or maybe they should just leave, because you know what. And then there's a lot of these companies have the audacity. A lot of them are run by boomers. Sorry to be derogatory here, but like, you know, they run by like a guy and he's like 60s, 70s who tries to tell his workforce, like, yeah, you know, actually it's very important that you come to the office and you compose yourself in this manner. And you know, they try and tell you, oh, you know, you need to commit yourself to work, and you can't be having a life outside of work. Work is your life, blah 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 blah. And it's like, no, go fuck yourself. I'll find myself a job where they'll give me what I want. And do you know what? And more to the point, it's not really an unreasonable thing to ask for remote working. I mean, the word that I keep hearing is the hybrid option, which I think is sensible. Do you know what I mean? Give people, say, like I used to do this when I lived in Estonia in Europe. I'd work like 3 days a week in the office, and typically I'd have 2 days at home, or 1 day at least at home. And you could work your life around that and agree on it and stuff. And you know, I think it's very good for, especially for people with families that get like unexpected kind of situations where they got to, like, I don't know, pick up their kids randomly or something happens. Do you know what I mean? You can take advantage of that option. It's an extra incentive, which doesn't affect businesses. Like, I haven't seen anything out there that suggested that remote working has been anything other than productive. But what were your thoughts on that?
So I mean, there's been some new developments too, with like Apple. You know, Apple, I think originally their campus out in Palo Alto here in California, they said that most people are going to be able to work remote, and they're walking that back, and people are threatening to quit. But then there was also something that came out, I think, from Iceland, that they did a kind of a pilot program and had everybody work like 4 days instead of 5, and it was like 36 hours kind of a week, and production efficiency didn't fall off or anything like that. So it is kind of this big debate, and here at least I think that's a lot of big corporations were just, as corporations do, we're just trying to say the right things during the pandemic so people, you know, didn't have any backlash against their companies. And now that we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, or at least there's less restrictions and everything. I mean, the virus is still around, but now all those companies are kind of walking back all their promises. And I think they realized a lot of these companies own their own building, or, you know, are leasing these spaces in office towers. The landlord's not going to let them get out of the lease because they're not going to have anybody else to put in that lease. So the landlord's going to lose money. So they don't want to do that. And the companies that own their own building, if they let everybody work remote out of that building, then they just have an empty office building that they're paying for. And I think that's the core issue that does not get covered, is just the companies don't want to lose money. And so they're like, yep, everybody needs to be in the office because it's more efficient. And it really isn't, but they're just not willing to eat that sunk cost of having this office building just sit there.
Yeah, I mean,
vacant, or try and sell the office building for, you know, they wouldn't make as much profit or loss.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you, especially about the sunk costs. And I mean, I remember when I was in Estonia, there was this business I worked for, right? And they already had like this flashy office, but it wasn't like the best office ever. But it was functional. It was fit for purpose. And they chose to move us to like the most expensive building. And, you know, the whole thing was a giant flex. It was like, look at us with all our money. Look at all this stuff that we can show off and put on Instagram and make us look like we're $1 million. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is a waste of money. Like, you're a business, you're trying to make money. And it's like, I don't know, if I was a business owner, like, I would spend money where I need to spend. I wouldn't be cheap, but I wouldn't spend extravagantly and try and, you know, show off or even care, like, because a lot of the time with these businesses, they're closed off. They're not always open to the public per se. Do you know what I mean? Like, unless you have like occasional sales meetings or whatever. Like, generally speaking, the only physical spaces you need for people are like people that are in sales, IT, you know, / programming. And then after that, I mean, geez, even programmers can work from home, to be honest. Most
they have the right setup.
Yeah, and actually, no, I could take it back. Even salespeople, that's been proven. There's been entire companies, sales companies, that have managed to still operate from home. Like, we're sort of shifting towards internet-only based solutions, what with like VoIP services and on a corporate level and such. So, I mean, there really aren't any excuses anymore. And I think that's making those big companies panic. Like you say, that they're panicking about those sunk costs. They're panicking about, oh, what do we do? How do we get out of this situation? And they're trying to propose something that is illogical and irrational. And I think that's where the problem is. They're trying to find ways to justify keeping the office. But I really do feel like this is the death of the office, to be honest. But
yeah, I mean, it all kind of, you can trace a lot of it back to like, it's like the mid 2000s when Google kind of came on the scene.
Right.
And when they opened like their campus, it was like, we have a dry cleaner here. We have the, you know, we have all this stuff here. Their whole concept was to basically keep the worker there as long as they could without leaving the campus. If we have all these utilities here for them, they'll be here longer and they'll work more and be more productive. And that is, you're just trying to kind of break that mentality and that cycle. And this is, you know, just what we're seeing is just people butting heads with corporations now. And I don't know where it goes. It'll be interesting to see if, you know, the Apple workers actually decide to quit and force Apple's hand, or that'll be interesting to see kind of what happens.
It's like a giant cult, man. I've never understood that. Like, don't get me wrong. I understand if you're young, you've got no responsibilities, you're really invested in your career and you're excited about it. I get that. You can do it for a couple of years, whatever, right? But like, most people have a life outside of work. You know, work is work. You know, I mean, there are people obviously that love their jobs and props to them. You know, I understand. I'm a bit of a workaholic myself, but you got to have time to do other stuff. Like, it's not just about having like a healthy balance between work and play, but it's also just, I think it's good for your mind and your body and everything to get out of that space and do something different. Like, I don't think it's ever healthy to do anything too much. You know, for instance, spend too much time around a particular person, spend too much time at work, spend too much time not doing work, you know, like, everything in moderation, so to speak. But yeah, those places just seem like hellholes to me. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a weird thing with here, especially here in America. I'm not sure how much it is like over there, but people identify with their job. So like when you first meet somebody, right? Usually one of the first 2 or 3 questions you're going to get is, what do you do? And so it's not, and so people kind of identify with, oh, I'm a salesperson, or I'm a pharmaceutical rep, or whatever, where it should be, you know, and this goes to kind of like minimalism and stuff. Like, you should be asking somebody like, what are you passionate about?
Yes.
Right. It's really tough to like break that, like, kind of Q&A, like when you first meet somebody, because you always kind of default back to like, well, I've always been trained to ask like, what do you do? But I don't care what you do. You don't care what I do. Like, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, unless you're at like a business, like networking event, like, I don't care that you're, you know, a rep for, you know, whatever, or machinery company. Like, okay. Like, I don't really care about that. Like, what do you like actually like to do in your off time? Like, that's more interesting. Where do you like to travel and stuff like that?
I agree with you, but I do think it's contextual. Because like in that scenario that you just laid out, when you're at one of those networking events, like you probably didn't want to go there in the first place. You just have to, you know, your sales manager was like, yeah, you know, this is a great opportunity to find new clients, blah, blah, blah. So you're there and you're bumping around. You're like, yeah, nice to meet you. Yeah, go fuck yourself. I don't care. So yeah, and then, yeah, I get that. You're just in another place with a bunch of other people that you don't give a shit about. And you're just flexing on each other, essentially, like, yeah, you know, I work sales at this company and this is how much we're projected to make and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, Okay. But I think like in other contexts, like if you're out with your buddies, you're having drinks and you're asking and that question comes up, it's not as bad. Although I do agree with what you're saying. I think I know I've changed this recently. My first question tends to be what you're passionate about, because I think that is, as you said, more engaging, like that's more interesting. But I do think it's contextual. Sometimes asking people about their jobs is interesting, but I think only if you really mean it, like if you really actually
Right. Yeah.
know. Yeah, because a lot of the time, as you said, it's that typical, oh, how much are you earning, and what kind of car do you drive, and it's like, all right, it was this fucking capitalism Q&A, like fucking hell. So,
Yeah, for
it's the
sure.
world we live in, but still, man. All right, so we've had a little bit of a chat. We're comfortable now. Let's talk about you. So you run a podcast and a website under the name Spoon Mob, which reviews chefs, sommeliers, I think I said that correctly, and wines from around the world. Tell us how this all started and what are some of the greatest successes that you've had with this brand.
So I mean, you can trace it back. It's basically I was working, living in kind of a suburb of the city, working a job, and just, you kind of reach this point where you're just like, what am I really doing? Like I'm working this job and you just kind of are, looking towards the next thing that you're going to purchase or whatever. And I don't know. I mean, it was probably like a mix of, depression and that, and just kind of analyzing life and everything. And just, wasn't stuff that I wanted to do. Like, this is what I'm going to do. Like, I don't want to be, when you die and they're talking about your funeral, and it's a little morbid to think this way, but like, you don't want people to be like, oh, he was the best salesperson at company XYZ. Like, you don't want that to be kind of like your legacy, you know what I mean? Or whatever. So, again, very morbid, but, so just kind of going along that train of thought, and just, my wife, who's my girlfriend at the time, she was going to go on a trip to Seattle to visit a friend from high school, and she was going to go with other friends from high school. They all kind of wound up dropping out for one reason or another. I wasn't originally planning on going just because I didn't really want to go on like a high school friends trip. So when they all dropped out, I was like, I always wanted to go to Seattle, see if it was someplace that I wanted to live. And at that point too in my life, like I had been working for a company where I was traveling a lot, but it wasn't to destinations you'd want to go to. It was to like middle of the nowhere locations because there were manufacturing plants there for the company that I was working with.
Right.
So I was just kind of like burnt out on travel just because all I had been traveling to is like little podunk towns and stuff like that. And so went to Seattle, had a great time. And then we started traveling a little bit more and kind of got into traveling and started eating at different restaurants and got into, eating and focusing on that. And we went to, my wife, she had to go to Singapore for her job. She'd been there a couple of times, but she had to go there for like 2 weeks. So I flew over for a week, and she would be working during the day, and I would just go around the city and sightsee and do a bunch of stuff. And one thing she had never done when she was there a few times was the Marina Bay Sands Hotel. If you're not familiar with it, you can Google it, but looks like a surfboard on stilts. And it's in the Marina Bay area of Singapore. And they have at the one end, they have this famous infinity pool. So you're, 30 stories high, and there's like an infinity pool, but you have to stay at the hotel to have access to it. But on the one end, they have this observation deck. And I had gotten into kind of like photography and stuff like that. So I always look when we were traveling, different places that you could get different vantage points of like skylines and stuff like that. So we went up there, and it was, you couldn't really get a good picture of the skyline. Like the safety glass that they had a bunch of fingerprints, scratches in it, and all this stuff. And you couldn't get a high enough point to where you could get a clear shot over the safety glass if you're far enough back. So, we kind of had that experience, and I was like, man, I wish somebody would, like actually have like a travel guide or something that said, hey, you should not do this, even though this comes up on all kind of the travel websites or whatever, like this is something you should do. But somebody that had one that was like, no, don't do this. Go over here to, this bar that's in this skyscraper because you're going to have a better vantage point or whatever. So that kind of sparked the idea of, well, maybe I could do that. Like maybe I could write a travel guide. So I started writing like a travel guide. And when as I do with most things, just super far into it. So it was like getting like census data and like weather data, best time to go there, stuff like that, history of like, the city or whatever. And I wrote it out, and I had basically one chapter for each city, and I was going to do like 12, chapters in a book. Like if you were traveling and you could travel somewhere once a month, that was kind of how I had it formatted. I was getting to the point where I was going to start looking for independent like publicators or, how to get it published and stuff. And I couldn't quite wrap my head around, like, if it takes a year to get this published, when it's done, like how much of this information's out of date, and stuff like that. How do you keep it updated? How is it worthwhile for somebody to read this? And so then I had the idea of like, what if I just put it online on a website? So I built out a website, built all these pages out. And as you do with stuff that you create, you kind of self-audit and stand back every once in a while and look at it. And I was like, man, each page is pretty long. Like, I don't know if anybody's going to want to read like for 30 to 45 minutes, like through, each city or whatever. So I was like, how do I, make this more user-friendly and pare it down? And started whittling down different parts and stuff like that. And then kind of evolved into just focusing on the restaurants, because that's how we were building all our trips. Was whatever restaurants we would go to, we would do those kind of reservations first. And then we would fill in the sightseeing stuff for, whatever you wanted to do kind of in the city. Because you could kind of do that whenever, the hours of them being open is usually 8 to 10 hours a day versus a restaurant where maybe it's only, 4 or 5 hours, something like that. So you have a narrow window. So started focusing on that. And it just kind of evolved from there to just, once we realized that's the stuff that we really enjoy, it was just kind of focusing on the food. And so originally it was just kind of pared down into favorite restaurants. And I had all this information about like the restaurant opening and different chefs that had run the restaurant and stuff like that. And then that kind of morphed into, after talking with the chef, basically like focusing on the chef themselves, because they're what makes it your favorite restaurant. Was the experience that you had when they were there working and cooking. You might still like the restaurant if they leave, but it's not going to be the same experience. And if you think back to how many times where, maybe you go to a restaurant and you're like, that restaurant was really good. And then you go back like 6 months later and you're like, it's just different. It's not the same. A lot of times it's because somebody left, or they have, different purveyor for ingredients and stuff like that. So started focusing on that, and then started, so had these pages written up, and I was like, well, what do you do for people that don't want to read? They don't want to read on their phone or like that, because that's a big thing. Like people don't read as much as they used to. So I was like, well, what if I just do a podcast and just basically audio, record everything in audio format so people can listen to it, on the go or whatever. And so it became this kind of 3-pronged thing where there's a podcast, for people that can listen to it if they don't want to read. There's a portion that people can read if they don't want to listen. And then there's Instagram, so they can see visual aids and stuff like that. And it all just kind of became like proof of concept, almost like doing the podcast, okay, people are actually listening to this, and it's people that I don't know. So what's like the next step with that? And we tried a few different concepts, and then it kind of morphed into, all the research I was doing on different chefs. You would always find contradictory things. They went to this school during, this time period, but maybe another article would say it was later. Separate article would say they worked at this restaurant, before they went to school, and the other two said something different. So I was like, well, what if I could get a chef to come on the podcast and actually kind of explain their career in their own words, so it wouldn't be taken out of context on them, but it would kind of set the record straight. And reached out to some people, and people were like, yeah, I'll do it. And just kind of been going ever since with that, and interviewing chefs. And it's been a lot of fun. And here we are.
So the podcast has a similar format to mine in that, you do your research on these chefs, and essentially you're detailing their career. And you're kind of giving people listening like the opportunity to go, hey, this is how this person's mind works. This is like their background, their approach to these things. And then by listening to all of that and hearing the stories shared and et cetera, it kind of it acts as an advertisement for that chef and their restaurant and everything like that. And it's obviously useful to you because it's, adding to that kind of ongoing kind of database, so to speak, and constantly providing more info.
Yeah. And I think for the, I'm always thankful for anybody that agrees to do the podcast, just because, with chefs, they usually get 1 or 2 days off a week, and it's like they're going to spend an hour or 2 hours out of their one day off a week to do a podcast that they've never heard of from some guy who randomly asked them, so I'm always still amazed by people that say yes and want to do it. But yeah, it does help, I think, build kind of a connection between, maybe somebody was thinking about going to that restaurant and wasn't sure what the experience would be like or why they should go. And then they would hear that interview with the chef and be like, oh, okay, now I get kind of why the food is like that. Like, I'm going to go try it. I'd be more interested in trying it. And I think it helps build a connection with people that either had eaten there before or maybe don't understand kind of why things are the way they are at that restaurant or the food that they create and stuff like that. And I think it really helps, especially with everything being closed and COVID and everything. And all restaurants basically have to rebuild kind of their core customer base. Even if you didn't close, you still lost people who are scared to eat out or scared to do takeout or haven't been to restaurants in over a year or whatever. So you have to kind of get those people back again. And I think there's no perfect way to market a restaurant. There's no perfect way to market anything, I don't think, anymore. You have to do all these different things and they kind of pool into one. And I think it's just another avenue for people to come on and talk about their experiences in the restaurants. And it seems to work. I mean, it seems to help the restaurants that, we've been able to have on and chefs and stuff like that. And so it's been going good from at least that perspective.
You mentioned, obviously, it's quite difficult in terms of, the schedules of the chefs in terms of like arranging to find time and stuff. But like you said, they've been very accommodating. But is it difficult to actually get them on the show? I mean, I've seen you've got a lot of episodes now. I think you've got at least 200. Is that right? Shows at this point?
But not all of those are. I mean, we're in like the 150s, but there's not all of those are chef interviews. We're probably at about 18 to 20 chef interviews. We started doing those at the beginning of this year, but the podcast itself dates back to June 2020. When I first started it, it was just basically I would do just solo episodes, just kind of recapping all the research that I did. And then we started a concept because me and my friend were pretty bored. There wasn't a whole lot of new content or anything. So we started rewatching Anthony Bourdain episodes and we were doing a recap podcast, food news kind of one. And that I eventually stopped doing. Just, it was a lot of work to continuously kind of keep up with new things that were going on in kind of the industry with COVID and everything. But there was still value in it for me because it gave me more reps and recording and being comfortable behind a microphone and learning how you speak and different ways that you need to kind of change. When you look back through your recording and you're doing editing and you're like, oh, I need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing this. I need to, change how I say this. And so it's all been beneficial. Maybe it doesn't, behind the scenes, probably it's been more beneficial for some of that stuff. But in terms of actual chef interviews, we've done, I think, about like 18 or so far that have been released. And that's kind of started, like I said, about like January. I think the first one we did was like the last day of December or something, the very first one.
So what's the, I suppose, the overall goal with this podcast? Obviously, we know that, like you said, you're trying to build this database, you're trying to inform people and kind of solve a problem that you yourself had faced and, many others sort of face. But moving forward with this, you've got your concept, you've got the format, it's very clear what you're going with here. But like, let's say in the next couple of years, like, well, what do you want to do with this podcast? What's the overall goal?
I definitely think it's continuing to focus on the chef interviews. I think that's the episodes that people enjoy the most. I guess the goal would be just to grow it to the point where, sure, would we like to eventually have some sort of advertiser or something like that? Sure, but it's kind of weird because I wouldn't want to advertise anything that I don't believe in. So that gets kind of weird in a gray area. But yeah, would we love to get to a point where it's like, maybe some revenue that we somehow generate like pays for a dinner, or we can donate some of that revenue to a food bank or something like that. Like, that'd be great. But it's still at the stage for me, I think, where if you're not having fun, don't do it. And it's still a lot of fun for me. But I think really it's just growing it, reaching more people, help, and I think with the more people that we kind of reach and more listeners and stuff that we get, we'll be able to get bigger and bigger names, chefs, people that probably recognize, there'd be more incentive for those people to come on the podcast who probably aren't interested in doing it right now because it's so small and they don't see the benefit, and you'd be able to get more people and talk to different, people and get different perspectives and everything. And I think that's kind of the way forward. It's just kind of growing it. And the concept will be, mainly the chef interviews and everything. And we'll still tinker with other concepts that we find interesting and everything. But, I enjoy doing it. It's definitely, you could say it's a passion project, but I definitely want to see if I can make it, my quote unquote career, I guess. But if it never gets there, that's okay, as long as I had fun doing it. But definitely want to make sure I give 110% to see if it pans out,
Yeah, same here, man. And just when you were talking there, you sort of mentioned something that annoys me too. I often get a lot of people say, "Oh, cool, yeah, you got a podcast. Oh, who's been on it? Anyone I would know?" And that alone is not an unreasonable question. But I always do find that a lot of people just seem disinterested as soon as you say that you haven't had any celebrities or whatever. And I just think that's a really dumb way to think. You know what I mean? Because number one, you can have a celebrity on your podcast. That doesn't mean it will be a good episode.
Very true.
It's all about being able to be a good conversationist. I've been extremely lucky. This is episode 99 of my podcast now. And I've always kind of adapted to my guests. So sometimes if they talk more, I talk less. I just guide the conversation. If they talk less, I try and probe and push and stuff. And I feel like, a lot of celebrities that I've seen tend to be quite quiet. You really have to push them to get something out of them, and sometimes that kind of puts me off the idea of having celebrities on my show, to be honest. I mean, I would love to, obviously it would help and everything, but I don't actually think that it would necessarily do anything for the show. I feel like the best thing you can always focus on is having good conversations, producing good content. You know what I mean? Like that's always my focus. And when I look back over, close to 100 episodes, the thing that I always think about is this was a good conversation. There's something beneficial in this. There's something good in this. So bringing it back to your podcast, I feel it's even more important because, you're providing a sort of a service, so to speak. And I feel like it's much more useful for you to have like this, reviews of chefs that are lesser known, but maybe restaurants that are more well-known or up and coming. That's more useful to your everyday kind of person that's shopping around and thinking where to go. Like what's the point of interviewing like a Gordon Ramsay or something like that? Like everyone knows this person, they kind of know what to expect. And I don't know, there's not really much else that can really be said. I mean, I suppose you'd have to approach it differently. I thought that's
the thing. It's the dilemma of if you had somebody that, and I think about it every once in a while, it's like if you had somebody that everybody knows the name or somebody who's famous, how would you approach that? Because their story's been told numerous times.
Yeah.
So you'd have to find something that maybe they don't talk about too much or, and it's easier for some chefs than others. Like somebody like Gordon Ramsay, like I don't like what would you even, he had his restaurants, he does a bunch of TV shows now. Like what would you even talk to? And what would you have to find that subject to that he would not only be interested in talking, because as you know from doing podcasts, sometimes when you touch on something, especially with chefs, like I've had one where he's super big he does paintings.
There you go.
But nobody ever really asked him about that in like the interviews that he did. And he just like lit up when we got to that point. He was like, oh, this guy knows that I do paintings and like it's something that I'm like super into. And you can see kind of the person just light up and spark up and they're like, oh yeah. And so like, what would that be for like a Gordon Ramsay? Be that thing for him, feel like it's just another press interview that I'm doing for whatever TV show that's coming out.
Yeah.
But what would also make it interesting to the listener that they would get value out of it, whether it's entertaining or they would learn something new about Gordon Ramsay if they're a big Gordon Ramsay fan or like too. So you're always kind of balancing these things about like, yeah, is it interesting for me? Would it be interesting for that person? And then the people that are listening, would it be interesting for them? And you're kind of always trying to figure out like, what's the best kind of way to piece all that together.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I thought about it, actually. When I think about having a celebrity on my show, you have to ask them some questions they've already been asked, or something around that, because, you know, of the nature of who they are, what they do and stuff, and people will want to hear that. But you're absolutely 100% right. Yeah, that's the way to get them, is to get them talking about what they're passionate about, what they're interested in. Like if I was going after Gordon Ramsay, I think I would probably focus on trying to do a sort of career retrospective, get his kind of overall thoughts on things in general, like where he was, where he is, and then, as you say, yeah, get into the meat and bones, like try and explore. And I think, like, sometimes, you know, like for instance, at the beginning of this podcast, we have a little chat, you know, you see where it goes. Sometimes I've had episodes where that's literally all it's been. You know, I didn't even barely use the questions I had, because the conversation just naturally happened. And I think in an instance like that, potentially, you know, if you can get that out of that person, that's kind of perfect, really. But
yeah, and I think, you know, going back to your point too, like it is more beneficial, I think, in a way, to have people that you haven't heard of, that aren't these big names, because the big names, like you said, that you've heard their story, you can find a lot of information about them too. But, you know, there is, like, I think people forget with somebody like actors, right? Like, they get paid to convince you that there's somebody else for 2 hours or whatever. So you're not going to get that person. Like, I think people think, oh, I'm going to get, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio from The Wolf of Wall Street. That's the episode that I'm listening to. It's like, no, you're getting the guy who, like, morphs himself into all these different people over the course of his 15-year, 20-year career. So, like, it's not going to be what you think it is. And I think that sometimes that leads to people being, like, a little disappointed, like, oh, it wasn't as interesting as what I thought it was going to be. It's like, well, yeah, the guy gets paid to, like, make you believe he's somebody else. Like,
you touched on something as well. Like, I've seen so many interviews out there that infuriated me. Like, for instance, I found some interviews online of, like, David Bowie getting interviewed back in the day, and the interviewers would just ask him, like, really stupid questions. And I'd be like, you've got this man, he's a megastar. You could ask him anything you want, and you ask him, like, really just stupid stuff. And, like, you can see he's visibly annoyed, and sometimes he just, like, laugh it off. Other times you get annoyed. And I was like, I don't blame the guy. Like, this is so trash. And it's like, if you're going to do an interview, yeah, look, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's impossible to know what other people have asked that person. You can do a bit of research beforehand, but celebrities get interviewed, like, thousands of times. So it's impossible to not ask them something they've already been asked. But as you say, like, if you go into it with the right mindset of, yeah, I'm going to interview Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, and focus on his mindset and his approach and yeah, his passions and driving forces in life, that's going to be interesting, and that's going to work, and he's going to be motivated, and we're probably going to get more out of it.
right.
You know, like, I know, for instance, Joe Rogan's podcast is very polarizing. It gets different, you know, good, positive and negative vibes. I get that. But his approach is fantastic. I've always really been inspired by that, because I think that that's the ideal. You make your guests feel comfortable, you get a conversation going, you see where it goes, and in between that, here and there, you can ask them some of those questions. You could even ask them something that they've been asked 1,000 times, and they'll give you that answer, but they'll be happy to do so, and you could probably expand upon that. You know what I mean? So, like, you take, Leonardo DiCaprio. Let's say you're talking, and then, you know, The Wolf of Wall Street comes up, and then you just, like, laugh about a particular thing that happened. And you're like, what was that like? And then he starts talking about it, and then you ad lib. Now, that's something I've learned to do in the past, I guess, 50 episodes, is ad libbing and just paying attention to the conversation, rather than, oh, I need to go from question 1 to question 5 and then see what happens. You know, it's you know, something you flow with, and it's easier to listen to.
Yeah, and that all comfortable that you get as an interviewer and stuff like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But like, I have questions, you know, that I do research beforehand, but yeah, I mean, if you saw the amount of questions that I have, like, they're not even probably, like, maybe just over, like, a whole space. Like, it's not that many. These are topics you can kind of touch on, use it as a guideline. But if the person goes this direction on, you know, talking about culinary school, well, yeah, you just kind of run out that topic until you get to a point where like, okay, we covered it, then you can kind of move on. So it's definitely this kind of give and take, kind of push pull that every interview, like you said, is different. Everybody's got different personalities, so it's not always the same thing. And you have to kind of figure out, like you said, do you have to ask more questions? You have to probe more. Can you just let them run for like 10 minutes on a topic and like not even have to do anything, and like but still be visually engaged, because like a lot of times it's like head nods and stuff like that, or stuff that's easy to edit out on my side of the audio. That way it's less work, but you still have the same kind of interview from their perspective too, because you're engaged visually with stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance for each person.
So talk us through your research process. Like how do you actually prepare yourself for these interviews, and what kind of research do you do?
So far, thankfully, it's been everybody I've had on the podcast is a place that I've actually eaten at myself. And I'd like to keep that going as long as possible. I'm fully aware that eventually I'm going to run out of people that I've actually eaten at their restaurant that are people that I want to actually talk to. And I already know how I can do it, where if I haven't eaten at that restaurant, and it won't be too different. But it's a lot of just reading different interviews that they've done. If they've done any, for any kind of the major publications, it's a lot easier if it's somebody who's in New York or San Francisco with a bigger newspaper. Like here in Columbus, a lot of the local chefs, we only have a few different kind of publications, but they don't do anything too in depth. And even if there is an article that did go in depth, it's probably from 3 years ago or something like that. Like, it's not like every year they're doing like an in-depth piece on, the chef or anything like that. So you definitely have to do a little bit more research and digging, going through, seeing if they have a LinkedIn profile and kind of lining up different places that they worked. And then you can kind of cross-reference and do some Googling on, if they've worked there, how long they were there, doing a bunch of research through the internet and just different Google searches and stuff like that. And, Instagram, going through, if they're active on Instagram, that usually helps too as well. But I think a lot of chefs aren't, the restaurant accounts are, but the chefs themselves aren't super active, or if they are, it's so you won't all from like their work history in that regard. But you just have to explore every single avenue that you can to get as much information. And then you just kind of have to sort through it and figure out what's interesting, what's kind of boring, does this transition into the next thing and stuff like that, and kind of construct it that way. But it's a lot of internet digging for sure.
So what do you think makes a good chef then? Like how do you judge that? Talk us through your sort of rating scale and all that stuff.
I mean, everybody's different, right? It's all subjective. The type of food that I like to eat is not going to be the same as somebody else. But in general, the podcast is kind of structured around, if you like eating similar stuff as to I do, and you can look at all the photos and stuff like that, well, then you'd probably like these experiences. But if you're somebody who just likes, bar food, like, you're probably not going to get too much out of kind of the podcast, because, chefs that generally do bar food are just probably more cooks. So these are more people that I'm kind of talking to and gravitate towards are more kind of the chef owner types. So they own the restaurant, kind of run the restaurant too as well. And it's really just people that are passionate about it and, are super creative too as well. I kind of view food as kind of this disappearing art almost, where, your restaurant will have this dish and maybe it'll be super, plated real well and super beautiful and everything. But that dish will probably only be on the menu for 3 months, because it's probably related to seasonality. So if it's on the summer months, because it has summer ingredients or something like that. So there is this kind of limited edition weirdness with it, kind of like it's art, it expires, but it also kind of, once it's on your plate and you consume it, like it's gone. So it kind of makes the whole food photography thing a little bit more interesting, because it's like you're capturing a moment in time that moment might never really come back again, because they might never make that dish again. Or if they do make it, it could be structured differently or plated differently or something like that. So it's kind of like all these different factors that come into play when it's good. Was it cooked properly? How was the service? And these are all things that you kind of take into consideration. And if it was a great experience and an experience that you would recommend to somebody who asked you like, hey, where should I go eat? That's kind of the general rule of thumb for like, yeah, this is somebody I would want to talk to. And then you reach out to them and see if they want to do it. And usually probably 1 or 2 out of 10 times you get a response and somebody says like, yeah, I'd love to do it. And then you just kind of go from there.
And what are your kind of thoughts on the influence of reviews of restaurants and sort of eating establishments in general on websites such as Glassdoor and Trustpilot and stuff? Like, what do you think about that?
So yeah, that's actually pretty interesting because I think a lot of people, it all kind of ties into almost like the newspaper industry in a way, because food critics were almost celebrities themselves for a while, especially like the New York Times. And now that people don't read the newspaper as much or subscribe to it because social media kind of replaced the news, there's definitely a less effect that a food critic in a major publication can have on a restaurant. They're still big, don't get me wrong. Like, you talk to different chefs and they're like, yeah, if we didn't get into this publication like that, we might not have survived for another 6 months. Like, there are some things, like for a while it was Bon Appetit magazine. Like, if you got into Bon Appetit and had a feature there, like, you saw your business quadruple like overnight and you were golden. So I think it's less of that now. So I don't think, food criticism, it's all subjective too. It's like with music or comedy or anything else. It's, does that person, you have to think of it as, this person may or may not like that restaurant that's reviewing it, but do I find myself eating at similar establishments along those lines that they do? So if you don't, then like that food critic has no value really to you and what you're looking for. So, that's why you can have different food critics, because some might gravitate more towards, ethnic food. Maybe they're super big into Asian cuisine, Chinese, Japanese, all that stuff. But maybe there's somebody else who's just really about super fine dining, elegant French cuisine. So you kind of have to, as with most things in life, you just kind of have to try and expose yourself to as much of it and then figure out what you really like and what you get value from, and then go with that. So, I mean, the days of kind of, I think, the New York Times, it's still important, but it's just doesn't have the same kind of power that it used to in the 90s or the 2000s, and social media kind of took over for a lot of that stuff. So you kind of almost have to gravitate towards like the person more so than maybe, the criticism, I guess. Or to find value in the criticism, you have to have something in common with kind of the person. I don't know.
Do you think it's quite as impactful as the media makes it sound? Do you know what I mean? So like, if a restaurant is getting a bunch of negative reviews online, is it really that bad, or is it just hearsay and they can sort of take that criticism? If you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, it's tough because, everybody has bad days. You could have a day where the restaurant is just not in sync and people are just messing stuff up left and right. And that was the day that you went there, and that sucks. And for you, that's always going to be a negative experience. But, maybe that was the one time out of the year that everything just didn't work that night in the kitchen. You know what I mean? But on the kind of the flip side of it too, it's like with, media criticism, like Yelp is always, I've found Yelp weird because it's this platform where everybody can go and say whether or not they like the restaurant. So that part I understand, but why would you, from a new user perspective, why would you believe any of those people? You don't know anything about them. There's a username and they published and they said, I didn't like this, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but why didn't you like it?
Yeah.
Was it because the food was overcooked? Was it because the service was too slow? Was it because the sommelier never came back and see if you want another glass of wine? Was it you showed up for your reservation at 8 and they didn't seat you till 8:20? Like, what was the context of that situation? And I think that's where, when you can provide more context for people, they can get an understanding of, okay, there were all these different factors at play. That's why this person didn't like that restaurant. Well, I probably wouldn't like that either, but would that happen to me? I don't know. I'm still kind of interested in going there, so I'm gonna give it a shot. Or maybe they're just like, oh, that person said, they had all this stuff happen to them. That's way more than I would ever want to deal with. I wouldn't even want to deal with half of that, so I don't want to go there. So I think context is really important. I think that's something that's been lost in a lot of it, is just people are, I like this, I hate this, this is good, this is bad, but nobody wants to say why. What are the reasons that you came to that conclusion? And that's kind of where I feel like, we kind of differentiate ourselves, is we're providing as much context as we can from our experience, so you can have kind of an informed opinion of this is likely the experience that you would have if you went there on your own.
What's the biggest life lesson that you've learned so far?
Biggest life lesson. You talking in general?
Whatever comes to mind,
General
I
lesson?
guess so, yeah. But whatever comes to mind,
I would say just try. There's so many people that I think don't want to try, or try once and give up. Effort is the only thing that you can control. There's so many other factors in everything that you want to do, whether it's a passion project or work, your job, your career, family, whatever. But the only thing that you can really control is the amount of effort that you put in on a daily basis. So, as long as you feel like you did everything you could at the end of the day, then that's where I think everybody should be at. But for me, it's definitely, like than me, or can get better access to bigger name chefs for the podcast or whatever. But I could also, I can try harder. I can reach out to more people than they do. I can wind up having more episodes. I could wind up having, different people on the podcast than they've had. And it's just, to me, it's always been about, just giving 100% effort, because that's the only thing that you can really control when it comes down to it. There's just so many other factors that can derail you. So as long as you do that, you should be at least in the top half of whatever it is that you're doing.
And as we draw things to a close for today, do you have any upcoming projects, or maybe some final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Upcoming projects, we're definitely going to be doing a podcast review on the Anthony Bourdain documentary. We're going to go see that this weekend. So skeptical on that, based on stuff that I've read and stuff that's come out. So I don't know how well that's going to go. I'm hoping I like it, but I'm a little worried that I'm not gonna. So we'll see. But still just interviewing chefs. We've been fortunate enough to kind of, the goal that I started out with was to have one chef interview every other week. And we've been on every week and release episodes pretty much every week since like the beginning of June. So we're going to keep that going as long as we can. And other projects in the works, you might be doing some different concepts in partnership with a platform, kind of exploring that, like a Patreon for food platform that's in the works. But so hopefully that'll come to fruition, and that'd be a cool avenue to meet new people and different creators and stuff like that. But yeah, otherwise it's just trying to make the podcast as best as we can, and provide as much valuable information and value to people who are listening, whether it's education, they learn something, or entertainment, helps them get them through their day, or gives them a new restaurant that they want to try, or something like that. As long as one person, I've always kind of said, as long as one person who's listening takes away something from that episode, then that episode's a success, regardless of how many total downloads it gets or total listens over 30 days or anything like that. At the end of the day, if you don't like what you're, don't enjoy doing the podcast, then there's no point, because there's a lot of people that I think start podcasts. I think it's like the average episode length for a podcast is like, they get to like 7 and then they wind up quitting or something like that.
Yeah.
So if you don't, and it's always, I see it on Reddit all the time. Like, how do I grow it? People aren't downloading it. It's like, you're on episode 3. Like,
yeah.
It's a grind. And if you don't like doing it, if you thought this was like, oh, I do a pod for money off of it. Like, no, for most of us, this is a hobby that we love doing and we're passionate about. And we would love to make a career out of it. But I think for a lot of us, we're okay if it doesn't get there. At least I had a cool hobby that I really enjoyed for however long it ran.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, I've had to work very hard just to get a very, very small listener base listening to this. And to be honest, I'm blown away. I don't know if I've ever said this to my listeners, by the way. But yeah, thank you for listening. It blows my mind that there are people out there that take the time to sit and listen to these, whether it's having them on in the background or sometimes even just sitting and listening and really engaging with it. Like, that's amazing. And that will always be much more important than having thousands of people listening and downloading. Like, I feel like as well, that stuff comes a lot later. I mean, yeah, I've used this example 100 million times, but I mean, Joe Rogan, I suppose he did like 400 episodes before he even started to gain any traction. And he's a celebrity. So what does that tell you?
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, it takes time. And yeah, I don't think you should do anything in life if you're doing it just to get numbers. And you know, we have like this obsession with numbers these days. How many followers do you have? How many views do you get? Blah 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 blah. It's like that stuff comes, but it takes time, and everyone has a different trajectory, and things click sometimes quicker for some people and later for other people. You know, I feel like even with me, like with this podcast, I still feel like it's a learning progress. You know, I feel a lot more confident than I did in the first 20 episodes, but I learn something new every single time, and I take something away from it every single time. And I think that that's just a good approach to have to content creation in general, is to always just try to have the right mindset, try to focus on producing the best quality thing that you can produce and make that your goal. And yeah, people will listen, people will hear the message that you're trying to put out, or the vibe that you're trying to put out, or whatever. You know, I've had people comment on my podcast recently saying that they feel like my interview style has gotten better, it's easier to listen to, blah blah blah. You know what I mean? Like that stuff does come. It's just takes time. And I think not a lot of people are as patient as they should be these days. You know, it's that instant gratification culture. You know, it's like, calm down, enjoy the ride, the numbers will come, just enjoy the process. But anyway.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love being able to come on other people's podcasts. I know my kind of background in podcasts with food and everything doesn't always fit for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of people that are into kind of, it seems like film reviews and horror movies and stuff I've seen that are always looking for guests, but so that's not really my scene. But whenever I'm able to kind of go on someone else's podcast and just have a conversation and not have to worry about any of the editing or anything like that, it's always fun for me. So I always love doing it whenever I get a chance to link up with people.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a pleasure to have had you, and I just want to say a massive thank you for being on the show. And yeah, I wish you all the best with the podcast and the brand Spoon Mob. Make sure everyone goes and checks this out and drops it a follow and has a little listen. Sounds like a fantastic project. And for everyone listening to the show, I just want to say thank you for listening, and let me know your thoughts. Let me know who you want to see on the show next time, what you want to hear on the show next time. Drop your thoughts in the comments below if you're on YouTube. Be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.